Throughout 2024, UK Defence Intelligence has estimated that the Russians have lost between 1,400 and 1,600 soldiers a day. Every day through 2024.
Vladimir Putin has challenged the West to a ballistic missile duel just days after a top nuclear general was assassinated in Moscow, and North Korean troops have suffered dozens of casualties in Kursk.
How unsuccessful was this assault? I mean, what do we know about the numbers of North Koreans who potentially were killed in it?
So I think the Pentagon's assessment was in the hundreds. We don't have a precise figure yet. There's been plenty of kind of grisly photos that have kind of been shared online that shows the corpses of North Koreans in kind of snow-covered fields in Kursk. I spoke to one special forces officer. He described one particular attack. This was all along the Ukrainians' left flank in Kursk on the morning of the 15th. And just one of these many attacks, he said, featured roughly 24 North Koreans. He wasn't sure if they all died, but, put it this way, as he said, the attack was stopped because they just seem totally unaccustomed to modern warfare, where you're constantly basically being watched by drones. There is constant surveillance, and in these kind of historical perhaps tactics or something, they were all clustered together. They were all kind of running at the Ukrainian lines, and the Ukrainians, they would have been bemused, but they've seen this before in, for example, Bakhmut.
They've lost tens of pieces of equipment a day. Russian storage sites for their armoured vehicles, even going back to T-55s and beyond that, are emptying extremely fast. Vladimir Putin is using his ammunition where he was in the early days of 2022, he had a 6-to-1 ratio of what the Russians could fire to the Ukrainians could respond with. At the end of 2022, or the end of 2024, we're now down to 1-to-2. And now they can still respond with more, but they're running out of ammunition. And Russian tactics have tweaked through the year. They're learning the lessons of how they're getting things wrong, and they're adapting that. They're adapting it in a way that in modern warfare is horrific, because it costs human life and they don't care about it.
Welcome back, everyone. In this episode, we're taking a look at 2024. The three-day war continues. Fighting has raged in Ukraine since Russia launched a full-scale invasion in February 2022. Russian forces have slowly expanded the amount of territory they control over the last year, mostly in the eastern Ukraine. But Ukrainian forces have made those advances as slow and difficult as possible, and even stage a counter-offensive into Russian territory. Here is a recap of recent significant events and the situation in Ukraine. In November, Ukraine reported its troops had engaged in combat with North Korean troops in the Kursk region of Russia. Moscow and Pyongyang have not responded to the claim that North Korean soldiers have been under fire, but US intelligence and NATO have confirmed there is evidence of North Korean troops being involved in Russia's war. The arrival of North Korean troops was cited by US officials as a reason for President Biden giving the green light for Ukraine to use long-range tactical missiles to strike inside Russia. How that decision will affect the war in the coming months is still yet to be seen. But Ukraine now has the potential to hit targets almost 200 miles or 300 kilometers from the Russia-Ukraine border. The appearance of North Korean troops in the Kursk region was a response to a surprise attack launched across the border by Ukrainian troops in August, advancing up to 18 miles or 30 kilometers into the Russian region. Almost 200,000 people were evacuated from areas along the border by Russian government, and President Vladimir Putin condemned the Ukrainian offensive as a major provocation. After 2 weeks, Ukraine's top commander claimed to control more than 1,200 square kilometers of Russian territory and 93 villages. The regions of Kursk and Belgorod have both declared a state of emergency. Some of that territory has been regained by Russia, but Ukraine still has troops in the Kursk region. The counter-offensive is seen partly as an attempt to force Russia to redeploy units from the east and relieve pressure on the beleaguered Ukrainian defences there, and partly as a bid to improve Ukraine's chances of a peace settlement. At the beginning of May 2024, Russian forces crossed the international border to the north of Ukraine's second biggest city, Kharkiv. several villages were seized and thousands of civilians fled. Russia's main offensive has long focused on the eastern Donetsk region, but this was one of the most significant ground assaults since the start of the war and further stretched Ukraine's frontline defences. The Russian push took place at the end of a 4-month period when the US was not supplying weapons to Ukraine due to a stalemate in the US Congress. The issue was finally resolved at the end of April when the US passed a $61 billion aid package to provide missiles, artillery, and air defense systems to the Ukrainian military. Ukrainian forces eventually held firm, and even though the city of Kharkiv has come under repeated attack from glide bombs fired by Russian warplanes, it remains beyond the reach and range of Russian artillery. The incursion north of Kharkiv was some distance from the main front line in the east, where Russia has continued its offensive operations and has been edging forward since October 2023. Eastern Ukraine has been contested territory since 2014, when Russian-backed fighters sieged large swathes of the eastern Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Russia's biggest advantage is manpower, and it has shown a willingness to throw soldiers at Ukrainian positions to gain a few metres at a time. According to the UK Chief of Defence Staff, Sir Tony Radakin, more than 1,500 Russian soldiers were being killed or wounded every day in October. That is the highest rate since the beginning of the war, exceeding the 1,200 being killed or wounded every day in May and June. Experts at the Institute for the Study of War believe Russian forces will likely to continue focus on seizing frontline Ukrainian towns and cities this winter, with the city of Pokrovsk as one of their main targets. The Russian advance towards Pokrovsk is the most notable change in control of the front line near Donetsk for several months, but innovative tactics by Ukrainian forces, combining the use of drones and ground forces, appears to have held up a direct assault by the Russians and inflicted significant losses of troops and equipment. The recent defence of Pokrovsk follows the Ukrainian withdrawal from Avdiivka, just north of Donetsk, back in February after months of fighting. Almost all of Avdiivka's pre-war population, more than 30,000 people, have left, and the town itself is almost completely destroyed. To the north, areas around Bakhmut have remained a flashpoint and have endured some of the heaviest fighting of the war. Although Ukraine gained some ground around Chasiv Yar, which is situated on high ground some 10 kilometers west of Bakhmut, Russian forces have since made further advances in the area. Russia's invasion began with dozens of missile strikes on cities all over Ukraine before dawn on the 24th of February 2022. Russian ground troops moved in quickly and within a few weeks were in control of large areas of Ukraine and had advanced to the suburbs of Kyiv. Russian forces were bombarding Kharkiv, and they had taken territory in the east and south as far as Kherson and surrounded the port city of Mariupol. But they hit very strong Ukrainian resistance almost everywhere and faced serious logistical problems, with poorly motivated Russian troops suffering shortages of food, water and ammunition. Ukrainian forces were also quick to deploy Western supplied arms such as the NLAW anti-tank system, which proved highly effective against the Russian advance. By October 2022, the picture had changed dramatically, and having failed to take Kyiv, Russia withdrew completely from the north. The following month, Ukrainian forces recaptured the southern city of Kherson. The Ukraine war remains a key issue for Moscow in 2024, with implications for its position in global and regional affairs. With the national defence spending reaching 6.3% of its gross domestic product and a third of the federal budget, the Russian economy is firmly on a war footing. The Russian leadership continues to maintain its maximalist stance on conflict resolution, with demands ranging from Ukraine's neutral, non-aligned nuclear weapon-free status to its demilitarization and to the lifting of Western sanctions. In addition, Moscow insists that a ceasefire or truce will not be the endgame, which should be based on a solid international agreement between all sides. While the election of Donald Trump has opened a window of opportunity for peace talks, reaching a consensus between Russia and Ukraine and addressing the European security architecture would require the utmost effort. At the global level, Russian efforts are divided on two fronts. The first is to navigate a mounting confrontation with the West. Though Russia's proclaimed red lines have been tested several times, the Biden administration decision to allow the use of the ATACMS missile to targets deep inside internationally recognized Russian territory has marked a new stage in the conflict. On the other front, Russia has stepped up its efforts to woo partners in the global south to construct a new world order and overcome Western sanctions. While the Kremlin has succeeded in demonstrating that Russia's isolation has failed, the goal of establishing new payment mechanisms, both bilaterally and in BRICS, has remained elusive. Even settlements in national currencies are not completely immune to sanctions. Moreover, as sanctions compliance has tightened, a growing number of companies and individuals from the global south are being blacklisted by the US for their links with Russian entities. In December 2024, the Russian Foreign Ministry announced that President Bashar al-Assad, who had governed Syria since 2000, had resigned and he had been offered asylum in Russia. Russian media say he is now in the country. The announcement follows the rapid collapse of the Assad government's military forces in Syria in the wake of an offensive from the Harayat Tahrir al-Sham, otherwise known as HTS, and other opposition groups, including the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army, or SNA, that was launched in November 2024 and culminated in the capture of Damascus in early December. What happens next in Syria and the region is uncertain. HTS has announced a transitional government and a general amnesty for those conscripted into the Assad forces. The UN envoy for Syria has warned the conflict has not ended yet. Opposition groups continue to vie for territorial control, with HTS and SNA taking areas controlled by the US-backed Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. HTS is a proscribed terrorist organisation by the UN, US, European Union, UK, and others. In December 2024, Israel has conducted military actions targeting Syrian military assets and chemical weapons facilities previously held by the Assad government, and says it has temporarily occupied the Syria-Israeli buffer zone. The fate of Russia's prized air and naval bases on Syrian territory hangs in the balance after the dramatic ousting of the Kremlin ally president Bashar al-Assad. Russia has two military bases in Syria, the Tartus naval base on the Mediterranean coast and the Kemenin air base near the port city of Latakia. They are considered among the Kremlin's most strategically important military outposts. The Tartus site is particularly critical, providing Russia with its only direct access to the Mediterranean Sea and a base to conduct naval exercises, station warships, and even host nuclear submarines. But according to Russian news agency TASS, Syrian rebel fighters have already taken full control of Latakia province, where both bases are based. The Kremlin says it is taking steps to establish contact in Syria with those capable of ensuring the security of military bases, according to spokesperson Dmitry Peskov. Russian state media has also claimed Moscow has secured the fate of the bases as part of the deal that saw Bashar al-Assad and his family offered refuge in Russia. But there has been a flurry of reports, including from Russian military bloggers, which suggest Russia is withdrawing from its bases. According to Ukrainian intelligence, Russia is pulling out its weapons and military equipment and evacuating troops from its Syrian bases. To retreat from Syria, the Russians have deployed a caravan of military transport aircraft, which are loading the remaining troops, weapons and military equipment, Ukraine's military intelligence agency said in a statement. According to Reuters, satellite imagery of Russia's Tartus base suggests that at least 3 warships have left the port and set anchor at sea around 13 kilometers from the coast. The loss of its military presence in Syria would be a big setback for Russia. Geographically and strategically, it is a critical site for Moscow to transit military assets into African countries where it conducts operations. The Institute for the Study of War warns that the loss of Russian bases in Syria will likely disrupt Russian logistics, resupply efforts, and Africa Corps rotations. If you're wondering what the Africa Corps is, it's the new name for the Wagner scumbags. This will particularly weaken Russia's operations and power projection in Libya and sub-Saharan Africa. The swift toppling of al-Assad's regime has already delivered a blow to Russia and its ambitions to expand its influence in the Middle East. The lightning speed which the rebels took Damascus has been partly attributed to the absence of the Kremlin's steadfast support as it focuses on the war with Ukraine. When Vladimir Putin took the reins of power in a post-Soviet Russia in shambles a quarter century ago, he immediately set about restoring Moscow's status as a global power. It took 15 years, but Russia heralded its military intervention in the Syrian civil war as proof of its return as a force to be reckoned with on the international stage. Moscow leveraged that image to expand its influence throughout the Middle East and beyond as a counterweight to the West. Now, the fall of the government of al-Assad, a key ally of Moscow, has dealt a serious blow to Russia's great power ambitions. Putin's military adventure in Syria was designed to demonstrate that Russia is a great power and can project its influence abroad. Losing Syria is a huge slap in the face for Putin. Russia's military intervention in Syria in 2015 changed the tide of the war. Moscow's devastating aerial campaigns against rebel positions helped the Syrian army regain swathes of territory and keep Assad in power. Moscow's Syria campaign came a year after the invasion of Ukraine Crimean Peninsula, as well as its support for separatist forces in Ukraine's east. Moscow capitalized on its involvement in both Syria and Ukraine to sell itself as a power capable of challenging the United States, NATO, and the West in general, while expanding its global reach from the Mediterranean to Africa and Latin America. Following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Syria became more of an asset for Moscow, analysts say, while also presenting the challenge of maintaining military campaigns on two fronts. With the anticipated fall of Russian military assets in Syria following the collapse of Assad's government, the task has become even more daunting. Russia is already heavily invested in major counter-offensive to regain captured territory in its southwestern Kursk region that it lost to Ukraine, to the point that it is relying on help from North Korean troops. At the same time, it is trying to take as much territory as it can in Ukraine's east before the possible peace talks. Russian military facilities along the Mediterranean coast in western Syria could be overrun by militants led by HTS, a US-designated terrorist organization and its allies. Moscow did not send ground troops to help Damascus, which fell to the HTS and its allies on December the 8th. Russia has conducted dozens of airstrikes since the militants launched their offensive against Assad's forces in late November, but Moscow's limited intervention did little to stop the rebel advance. Russia will pay a huge price for its failure in Syria, analysts say. So this war's clearly going to roll into 2025. One thing I can tell you, Russia's 3-day war currently sits at day 1035. This will probably be the last upload of 2024. The channel started in July. I'd like to quickly just thank all of you for subscribing, watching, the encouragement, the support, the constructive criticism. It's all really appreciated. Big things planned for 2025. Launch of the website, returning and documenting the trip to Ukraine. So stick with us. I hope you all have a fantastic Christmas and a blessed New Year. Don't forget to spare a minute of thought for the heroes defending Ukraine and for the heroes who have fallen defending Ukraine. Slava Ukraini, Herium Slava. Thank you all for watching.